The UFC stands as the greatest mixed martial arts promotion in the world. Its fighters are seen as some of the best in the octagon, but some are monstrous both in and out of the cage. This fighter is a primary example, as officers were forced to cover his face with a spit bag for his vicious retaliation to arrest. This former champion was put in shackles because of how dangerous he is. Even the UFC president, Dana White, considered one of these men to be a dangerous gangster.
Lee Murray is one of the most legit gangsters of all time.
Now let's find out why these fighters are spending the rest of their lives in a cage other than the octagon. Paul Anthony Kelly. This convicted UFC fighter came from a background of an amateur boxing family. Anthony Kelly grew up in boxing gyms as a result of this background. He was also known for getting into many altercations during his youth. To make matters worse, he was expelled from school due to this inherent behavior and never completed his education. Kelly's MMA career seemed promising as he started in Liverpool, England. He boasted an impressive 8-fight win streak, with the 8th being on his UFC debut against Paul Taylor. Things seemingly began going south for his career as the losses began rolling in. He had his first career loss against Marcus Davis via submission in the second round, and 3 more losses came after, the last of which was against Donald "Cowboy" Cerrone. This was also his last fight before being arrested in 2013 in connection with a drug-dealing ring. He was also accused of being the mastermind behind the entire operation. Kelly was found guilty of heroin trafficking charges in May of 2013 and was sentenced to spend 13 years of his life behind bars. He was sentenced by Judge Mark Brown, who didn't show remorse for him, even though he was a father of 2 at the time. Judge Brown made a notable statement to the ex-UFC fighter during the sentencing hearing. "You are an individual who has traveled widely in the course of MMA, and as such would have contacts abroad. It is significant that the seizures involved large amounts of import-quality heroin." Also adding, "In my judgment, you decided to supply Class A drugs when your contract with UFC was terminated. You obviously enjoyed the high life and saw selling heroin as a way to make easy money." This sentence has been said to be the end of Kelly's MMA career, as most promotions might not want to tarnish their image by signing him even after he is released. Now, Kelly's case was a simple instance of greed from someone who had tasted the good life and didn't want to let it go. This next person, however, lost his freedom due to his inherent and uncontrolled violent outbursts. Phil Baroni. This former mixed martial artist was arrested for allegedly murdering his girlfriend in a hotel room. Philip George Baroni was born to American parents in Massapequa Park in Long Island, New York. He attended Massapequa High School, where he was on the wrestling team. Being seen as a strong individual led him to have multiple street fights while growing up. Baroni attended Nassau Community College, where he became a 2-time All-American wrestler, placing 5th and 2nd in the nation. Unfortunately, he was expelled later in his senior year and forced to transfer to a different institution. His amateur kickboxing and boxing record was impressive as he studied kickboxing under Keith Trimble. He had 7 kickboxing matches, all of which he won by knockout. The former UFC fighter also competed in 10 amateur boxing matches. He won all 10 matches via knockout, which brought him a lot of attention, being a powerful striker, and had his UFC debut in only his 2nd professional fight on UFC 30. This fight was against Curtis Stout, a fellow striking specialist. Baroni won his debut fight by unanimous decision. His first career loss came at the hands of Matt Lindland at UFC 34.
Judge Tony Molinak scores it 29-28 for the winner, Matt the Law.
This encounter would eventually lead to a rivalry between both men. Baroni's signs of inherent violence became evident during a fight at UFC 45 against a teammate of his rival, Evan Tanner. He initially dominated the fight against Tanner, but after the referee, Larry Landless, paused to check on Tanner's cut, the momentum switched sides and Tanner began dominating. The referee ended the fight in Tanner's favor after seeing that Baroni could not defend several punches on the ground. This stoppage was controversial, as he claimed he told the referee he was all right. He struck Landless out of anger and was later suspended for 4 months for this violent outburst. It seems as though these violent outbursts remained a part of him, as he was arrested on January 3rd, 2023 for allegedly murdering his girlfriend. Baroni, who was 46 years old at the time, flagged down law enforcement in the neighborhood of his hotel. He informed them that his girlfriend was unconscious and needed immediate medical assistance. Upon arriving at the hotel room, the officers discovered a woman not wearing any clothes. She was covered in a sheet and had no vital signs. signs. Further examination showed that the woman had several injuries, including bruises to her face and body. Baroni was questioned, detained, and charged with the murder of his girlfriend. Carlos Contreras Legaspi of ESPN provided an update on the situation and informed the public that Baroni was recently transported to a state prison. The former Pride SF UFC fighter has been transported to Tepic, the capital of Nayarit, where he is now in a state prison, Ceriso. He also speaks on the hearing and the ex-fighter's possible punishment if he is found guilty. His hearing will be on Monday, where a judge will determine his legal status. If guilty, sentence goes from 30 to 50 years. Baroni's case seems bad, but it's not in comparison to the next fighter, who was a fighter by day and an armed robber by night, Lee Murray. Born in Greenwich, London, Lee Murray boasted an impressive mixed martial arts record with 12 fights and 8 wins. From his mother's side of the family, he hails from Bermondsey, a densely populated region in South London. It is considered a traditional breeding ground for all types of criminals, especially armed robbers. It seems the Greenwich-born fighter became a part of this tradition, as he was convicted of armed robbery. He was exposed to a lot of violence while growing up, especially street fights against kids from neighboring estates. He also had a difficult relationship with his father, who was always drunk and absent for the first 7 years of his life. Murray couldn't take this torture from his father for long. Brahim, the ex-fighter's father, struck him in one particular instance, and he snapped. He turned around and knocked his dad out with a punch. Their relationship only went south from that point, and Brahim moved out due to fear of someone losing their life. Murray's life of crime and violence only escalated from this point, as he was arrested several times for one form of violence or drug possession. Some officers at Plumstead Police Station mentioned how it was best not to aggravate him because he's a very dangerous man. Murray had a brief UFC career, as he only had 2 matches. His debut match occurred on UFC 46 against Jorge Rivera, where he won via submission. His second and last match occurred months later against Anderson Silva. Silva defeated him via unanimous decision. His MMA career came to a stop after he was stabbed multiple times outside a Mayfair nightclub. He miraculously survived his injuries, but was arrested in Rabat, Morocco in June 2006. Investigation revealed that Murray was the mastermind behind one of the UK's greatest cash heists, the Securitas Depot robbery. A gang of 7 men, including the former UFC fighter, tricked their way into the depot on 21 February 2006 and stole £52,996,760 in used and unused sterling banknotes. These notes were considered as property of the Bank of England. The gang left behind over $154 million because they couldn't transport it from the depot. After his arrest in 2006, Murray attempted to escape Sale prison, but his plans were foiled when a prisoner found small sores in a plate of biscuits. He had also lost weight to make his escape through the small window easier. He was convicted of the £53 million crime in June 2010 and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. This sentence was later extended to 25 years on November 30th, 2010. UFC President Dan White commented on Murray at one point, stating that he's a scary son of a bitch, and I don't mean fighter-wise. The next fighter on this list has lived his entire life in crime. Some even thought he had lost his humanity as he led law enforcement on a wild goose chase. Cedric Marks. Considered a veteran MMA fighter, Cedric Marks caused quite a stir online due to his actions and antics in attempting to escape from law enforcement. He had a long MMA career with 58 fights, 31 victories, and 27 losses. His last win came after a 6-fight losing streak, and this win was even against an unknown fighter. Marks has had a history of violence, crime, and jail time. His earliest interaction with the law was on June 4, 1992, when he had felony charges for assault, battery with a dangerous weapon, and attempted escape. Those initial charges were dismissed, but records show that the former MMA fighter pleaded guilty to a charge of attempted robbery with a firearm on August 21, 1992. That incident occurred in February of that year, and he served 6 years in an Oklahoma prison. He was eventually released on November 23, 1998. Now, most people would have expected Marks to turn a new leaf after being released, but that wasn't the case. He was arrested just 5 months after his release from prison on 2 misdemeanor counts of unlawful carrying of a weapon. It's also said that Marks was a countrywide criminal as he committed crimes in several states. He faced 3 charges from a municipal court of Seattle in 2008 and was found guilty of harassment. He also had a custody battle over his son with a woman named April Pease, who was from Washington State. Court documents described him as someone with aggressive behavior and as someone who was in complete denial that he has issues around domestic violence. Pease was given temporary custody over the child, but suddenly went missing in March 2009. The child was returned to his father, mother, and most people suspect he had something to do with her disappearance. Marks is most popularly known for his current case, which is the murder of his ex-girlfriend Jana Scott and her friend Michael Swearingen. Scott and Swearingen were last seen on January 4, 2019, and their bodies were found over a week later in a small town in Oklahoma. Before her death, Scott testified against her ex-boyfriend and informed the judge that he threatened to kill her and her family. She requested a protective order, but Judge Paul LePac dismissed her request. According to Scott, Marks boasted about his ability to conceal a murder. This could also relate to Pease's disappearance in 2009. He was arrested in Michigan for the murders, but escaped while being transported to Texas. This occurred when the guards stopped at a McDonald's to get food. A manhunt ensued for 9 hours involving multiple Montgomery County, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. He was eventually found hiding in a bin and surrendered without incident. He was convicted and sentenced to death for his crimes. He wasn't remorseful, as he had no problem with the sentence. Marks was said to be a monster in human clothing. But the next fighter on this list is so deranged, he legally changed his name to War Machine Jonathan Koppenhaver. Jonathan, popularly known as War Machine, is a former professional mixed martial artist with 19 professional fights. His MMA record stood at 14-5, with 4 of his losses coming from submissions, one of them by the judge's decision. He fought in various MMA promotions, the most prominent being the UFC. War Machine experienced personal trauma at 13 years old when he tried performing CPR on his father, who had a heart attack. Unfortunately, he was unable to resuscitate his father. He attended the Citadel, a public senior military college in Charleston, in August 2000, but was expelled for his poor behavior. He made his UFC debut against Jared Rollins and won the match via KO in the 3rd round. His last UFC fight was at UFC 84 against Yoshiyuki Yoshida, which he lost via submission in the 1st round. The UFC eventually released him after he rejected a fight offered by Joe Silva, a UFC matchmaker. Another reason for his release was the comments he made about the death of Evan Tanner, his fellow UFC fighter. His spree of violence became evident when he was found guilty of striking a Las Vegas man in the face and choking him until he was unconscious. This occurred during a parking lot scuffle on September 2, 2007, and he was sentenced to 3 years of probation with 30 days of community service. 3 years after this incident, War Machine was sentenced to 1 year in county jail for a felony assault conviction. This was because of a fight at a Point Loma bar in early 2010. He was imprisoned and kept mostly in solitary confinement. He later announced that he would serve another year of jail time due to the preceding events. War Machine was released in October 2012, and in 2013 he began dating adult film actress Christy Mack. Mack described him as physically and mentally abusive and controlling. On August 8, 2014, he viciously assaulted Mack and her boyfriend Corey Thomas at Mack's home. Thomas was his first target as he beat him for 10 minutes. Thomas eventually escaped, and War Machine set his target at Mack, whom he assaulted for 2 whole hours. Mack escaped through a balcony and went to her neighbor, who called the police. War Machine eluded law enforcement for a week, but was eventually apprehended. Officers used his IP address to trace his tweets. In 2017, he was convicted on 29 of 36 felony counts, including kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 36 years. Next on the list is a fighter who used his size and strength as a fighter and an enforcer, Rob Broughton. This English mixed martial artist competed in the heavyweight division and is a former British Cage Rage heavyweight champion. He also competed in the UFC, where he had 3 fights and lost 2 of them. He was ultimately released from the promotion after being unable to fight against an opponent on 2 consecutive occasions. In 2021, a judge in the United Kingdom sentenced him to 8.5 years in prison for his alleged role in a drug ring that involved millions in cash and also illegal substances such as cocaine. He was initially arrested for his involvement in the criminal ring run by 2 brothers, Alan and John Tobin, who allegedly supplied huge amounts of drugs to several gangs in England. The group's primary business was cocaine, but they were known to dabble into other drugs such as cannabis, heroin, and ketamine. The major reason for Broughton's conviction was that he served as the muscle of the operation. He also served as an enforcer for the Tobin brothers and transported large amounts of cash for them. The brothers often sent him to collect debts from people who owed them money, and being an enforcer, it's no surprise that he used force when he deemed it necessary. Broughton Jackson moved an estimated $30 million in cash, over $41 million. He also lent his services to Anthony and Leon Cullen. These individuals led a heavily armed drug gang in England. This drug ring ran from 2016 to 2020. The authorities were able to stop a massive shipment of cocaine that was valued at approximately 20 million SARS, or $25 million. This was the biggest UK land-based cocaine seizure at the time. Once arrested, Broughton confessed to his involvement in the drug gang and his role as an enforcer. His attorney tried all that he could to classify his client's crimes as money laundering. Unfortunately for him, the judge did not agree and saw that the former UFC fighter was fully involved in both drug trafficking and money laundering. He was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison, with the Judge Garrett Beyer, adding, "I've no doubt you have a keen sense of letting your family down, and I hope when you're released you have their best interests uppermost in your mind. Our next fighter simply shows that not everyone openly shows their violent and psychopathic tendencies, and these tendencies can suddenly surface." Jeremy Jackson. This fighter is a former mixed martial artist from Brawley, California. His professional record stands at 9-5 with 14 total fights. Jackson made his professional MMA debut on September 9, 2001, when he fought against Jake Shields in the Gladiator Challenge 6 Caged Beasts. He lost this fight via a rare naked choke in the first round. He also had a 5-fight win streak at some point in his career, but that ended against his rival Nick Diaz. He faced another loss to Diaz in his next fight, ending their rivalry. Although Jackson won their first encounter in September 2002 via a knockout, he was considered the loser of the trilogy after losing the next 2 fights. Aside from the UFC, Jackson also fought in Cage Combat, IFC, King of the Cage, Ultimate Athlete, and several other promotions. He also appeared on Tough 4, a special comeback season of the reality show. This season featured ex-UFC fighters, but Jackson's appearance on the show was short-lived. Dana White, the UFC president, kicked him out of the show after he violated the rules by leaving the house. Luckily, he was invited to fight in the season finale, but suffered a neck injury in a submission loss to his opponent, Pete Spratt. The Brawley-born fighter didn't display any forms of violence aside from facing an opponent in the octagon. However, on June 30, 2008, he was arrested and taken into custody by the Ventura County Sheriff's Office. He was charged with 7 felony offenses, including 2 counts of assault against his ex-girlfriend. Following a 3-week trial, he went against his lawyer's advice and pleaded guilty. His lawyer, Russell Baker, said he just got broken down. It was reported that a female juror asked to make a statement during the sentencing, but the judge denied it. The juror told a newspaper outlet that she felt the former fighter was innocent and pleaded guilty only because he wanted the trial to end. "I really felt the defendant was innocent," she said. The prosecutor against Jackson's case, Thomas Dunleavy, said he could have faced a sentence of 60 years to life. He stated that there was enough evidence to convict him of his crimes. The ex-fighter's decision to plead guilty landed him a sentence of 25 years to life. This case left some people wondering about Jackson's innocence. However, the next case makes you wonder just how twisted the human mind can be. Joe Sun. This actor and former made his way into the UFC by cooking up a fake career for himself. That's right, Joe Sun had no previous MMA experience before setting foot into the octagon. Through a mixture of lies and an extremely convincing attitude, Sun and his partner in crime, Kimo Leopoldo, convinced Art Davies, the co-creator of the UFC, to let them fight. Sun's MMA career was far from spectacular, as he had 4 fights and 4 losses. His first appearance in the UFC was his last, as he lost to Keith Hackney via submission in the first round. He also dabbled into kickboxing, but immediately realized he wasn't built for it after being defeated in the first round. Mind you, he lost all his fights in the first round. The self-made MMA fighter came into the legal spotlight when he was arrested for kicking in the door of his roommate's car. He pleaded guilty to felony vandalism on May 16, 2008, and was sentenced to probation and 60 days in jail. He was also required to provide a DNA sample as a condition of his plea agreement. In early October 2008, his DNA sample was matched to an assault cold case that occurred on December 24, 1990, almost 2 decades before his arrest. He was arrested at the Theo facility on October 7, 2008, while he was already in custody. On December 24, 1990, the victim, who remains anonymous for personal reasons, was walking back to her apartment alone with her dog. Sun approached her and distracted her by asking for directions. He also pretended to be lost. His accomplice, a high school friend named Santiago Gaitan, forcibly dragged the victim into his car and threatened to kill her. Both men assaulted the victim. They eventually released her, and she reported to the police. Both men remained at large due to how small the DNA database was then. Gaetan was eventually identified and confessed to the crimes. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 17 years and 4 months in state prison. On September 19, 2011, Sun was found guilty of 1 felony count of torture and sentenced to 7 years to life. His sentence was later increased by 27 years as he murdered his cellmate less than a month after going to prison. He is now serving 34 years to life. This next incident is beyond disturbing and will leave you wary of hallucinogenic substances for life. Jared Wyatt. This particular incident is extremely disturbing. Wyatt's MMA career was short-lived, as he had only 2 professional fights, both of which were victories via TKO. His career was quickly overshadowed by his arrest in the most gruesome murder case performed by an ex-MMA fighter. The Heart Ripper was arrested for murder and mayhem charges. He was accused of murdering his training partner, 21-year-old Taylor Powell, where he ripped out his still-beating heat and removed his tongue. It was reported that both men were on hallucinogenic drugs at the time of the incident. Wyatt ultimately pleaded guilty to first-degree murder involving mayhem. He agreed to a plea deal in which he would serve 50 years to life in prison for his crimes. He initially pleaded not guilty because of insanity, and this prompted psychiatrists to evaluate his mental competence. A judge later ruled that he was competent to stand trial. District Attorney John Alexander said the earliest he'll be able to see a parole board is 2062. He also said, "We saved Taylor's family the agony from reliving the incident at the trial." James Fallman, Wyatt's attorney, spoke about how they chose the best possible option in terms of his sentencing. "We looked for an agreement that would at least give him the opportunity to be paroled someday," Fallman said. Officers arrived at the Heart Ripper's house on March 21, 2010, at a home at the mouth of Klamath River. Upon their arrival, they found Wyatt naked and covered in blood. He immediately said to the officers, "I them," and spoke about how he cut out Powell's heart and tongue. The officers found Powell's body on the couch. They confirmed that his chest was cut open, and his heart, tongue, and skin of his face were gone. Upon further investigation, his heart was found charred in a wood-burning stove. An autopsy was conducted on the corpse, and it determined that his organs had been removed while he was still alive. Some witnesses stated that both men consumed hallucinogenic mushrooms before the incident. They believed they were involved in a struggle between God and the devil. Reports state that Wyatt was strongly convinced that the world was about to end, and Powell was the devil. Unfortunately, he took an innocent man's life in a bid to save the world. Our last name on this list seemed desperate for a few extra bucks. Unfortunately, this would cost him his career and freedom. Dmitry Sosnovsky. This former MMA pro fighter had a record that some consider beautiful. Dmitry boasts an 11-0 record and remains unbeaten. His last fight occurred on March 17, 2018, when he fought against Mark Godbeer in UFC Fight Night 127. The Wicked Machine won this fight via submission. He, unfortunately, had only one fight in the UFC, as his next bout was cancelled due to an injury. Dmitry was arrested by authorities in Moscow on charges of abduction and extortion. He was one of 5 men arrested and expected to be detained for up to 2 months while the investigation continued. The suspects allegedly abducted a businessman and forced him into an unmarked vehicle. They took him to an office and threatened to kill him if he didn't pay them 300,000 rupees or $3,800. The businessman refused to yield, and one of the men resorted to violence. A report from the prosecutor's office stated that the man attempted to choke the victim until he was unconscious. Having received a refusal from the abducted man to fulfill their illegal demands, one of the accused grabbed the victim's neck with his hands, the report stated. Luckily, the victim escaped when the kidnappers left the room. He reported the incident to the police, leading to the arrest. UFC veteran Alexei Oleinik was Dmitry's teammate and described his disappointment and frustration at the Wicked Machine for his apparent wickedness and greed. A judge found him guilty of kidnapping and extortion and sentenced him to 8.5 years in prison. This incident only adds to the growing list of Russian MMA fighters who have been involved in various crimes. We've also got some honorable mentions who have been to jail but are not incarcerated. Cain Velasquez. The former UFC heavyweight champion was arrested after going on a vigilante shooting spree when he attempted to kill a suspected child molester in 2022. He was convicted of attempted murder, shooting at an occupied vehicle, assault with a firearm, assault with a deadly weapon, and willful discharge of a gun from a vehicle. His sentencing was slated for October 2024, but had to be pushed back several months after Velasquez pleaded not guilty. Some investigators say Velasquez was seeking vigilante justice when shooting at the suspected pedophile. If you enjoyed the video, don't go anywhere. Just click on any of the cards appearing on your screen right now and get even more exciting content. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.